In 1935, Harlem lived under two kinds of power. One wore police badges and operated with the protection of the city. The other answered to the streets and moved through this neighborhood with a different kind of authority. When a police officer struck the mother of Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in broad daylight, it was not just an insult to one family. It was a public declaration that the line between law and brutality had been erased, and it would trigger consequences that no one in that neighborhood could have predicted. Who was Bumpy Johnson at this moment in his life? And why did this single act of violence change the balance of power in Harlem forever? To understand what happened in 1935, you have to understand who Bumpy Johnson was before that day arrived. He was not yet the legend that later generations would talk about in whispers and documentaries. He was not yet the man who would help shape organized crime in New York for decades. But by 1935, Ellsworth Johnson had already earned a reputation in Harlem that made people take notice when he walked down the street. Bumpy Johnson was born in South Carolina in 1905. His family moved to Harlem when he was a teenager, part of the Great Migration that brought hundreds of thousands of Black Americans from the South to northern cities in search of better lives. Harlem in the 1920s was a place of culture, music, and hope. It was also a place where poverty, overcrowding, and discrimination created conditions that allowed both opportunity and exploitation to thrive side by side. Johnson grew up in this environment. He was smart, observant, and unafraid. By his early 20s, he had already been arrested multiple times for minor offences. He understood the streets. He understood how power worked in a neighbourhood where the official law did not protect black residents the way it protected white citizens in other parts of the city. He understood that survival required more than just following rules that were never designed to protect him in the first place. By 1935, Bumpy Johnson was 30 years old. He was not a boss yet. He was not running operations across the city, but he was known. He was respected. People in Harlem understood that he was someone who kept his word, who protected his own, and who did not tolerate disrespect. He worked in the world of gambling, numbers running, and the informal economy that provided income for people who could not find legitimate work in a city that refused to hire them. He was part of a network of men who operated outside the law because the law had never offered them a fair chance. But Bumpy Johnson also had a code. He believed in loyalty, he believed in protecting family, and he believed that there were lines that should never be crossed, even in a world where violence and crime were part of daily life. One of those lines was simple and absolute. You did not harm someone's mother. You did not publicly humiliate a woman who had spent her life raising her children in dignity, despite living in conditions that denied her basic respect. That line was sacred. His mother was named Margaret Johnson. She was a working woman who had raised Bumpy and his siblings with discipline and love. She was known in the neighbourhood as a decent person who went to church, who kept her home clean, and who spoke to her neighbours with kindness. She was not involved in her son's business. She did not ask questions about how he made his money, but she was proud of him in the way that mothers are proud of their sons, even when they know those sons have chosen difficult paths. Margaret Johnson was respected in Harlem. People greeted her on the street. Shopkeepers gave her credit when she needed it. She represented something important in a community that was constantly under pressure from outside forces. She represented dignity in the face of hardship. She represented the idea that even in poverty, even in a neighbourhood where police treated residents like criminals by default, a person could still hold their head high and live with honour. Harlem in 1935 was a neighbourhood under siege. The Great Depression had devastated the entire country, but black communities suffered the worst of it. Unemployment in Harlem was more than double the rate in white neighbourhoods. Families were evicted from their homes. People went hungry. The dream of the Harlem Renaissance, the cultural explosion of the 1920s, had faded into the harsh reality of economic collapse. But economic suffering was only part of the problem. Harlem residents also lived under constant harassment from the New York City Police Department. Officers in Harlem operated with almost no oversight. They demanded bribes from businesses. They beat people in the streets for minor infractions or no reason at all. They planted evidence. They arrested people without cause and held them in jail cells overnight just to assert dominance. And they knew they could do all of this without facing consequences because the people they were abusing had no political power and no way to fight back through official channels. Police corruption was not unique to Harlem, but it was particularly brutal there. White officers who were assigned to patrol black neighbourhoods often saw those assignments as opportunities for personal profit. They shook down shop owners for protection money. They took cuts from illegal gambling operations and then arrested competitors to protect their partners. They stole from people during arrests, and they used violence freely, knowing that a black person's word would never be taken seriously against a white officer's testimony in court. This was not a secret. Everyone in Harlem knew how the system worked. Parents warned their children to avoid police at all costs. Business owners kept cash ready to hand over when officers came by for their weekly collections. People learned to walk away from confrontations, to keep their eyes down, to never talk back, because talking back could mean a beating or worse. The police were not seen as protectors. They were seen as an occupying force. But even in this environment, there were moments that crossed a line. There were acts of cruelty or disrespect that went beyond the usual extortion and violence. And when those moments happened, they did not just disappear into the background noise of daily oppression. They became stories, they became symbols, and sometimes they became turning points. The incident happened on a spring afternoon in 1935. Margaret Johnson was walking home from the market. She was carrying groceries. She was minding her own business. She was not involved in any kind of trouble. She was simply a woman walking down the street in her own neighborhood. The officer who stopped her was a white cop named Thomas O'Brien. He had been on the Harlem beat for several years. He was known in the neighborhood as one of the worst. He was aggressive, foul-mouthed, and quick to use his nightstick. He had a reputation for stopping people for no reason, for demanding identification even when there was no legal basis to do so, and for making crude remarks to women. People avoided him when they saw him coming. No one knows exactly why O'Brien stopped Margaret Johnson that day. Some accounts say he was drunk. Others say he was angry because a shop owner had refused to pay him his usual bribe. Still others say he simply saw an easy target and decided to assert his power. Whatever the reason, he called out to her and ordered her to stop. Margaret Johnson stopped. She turned around. She asked what the problem was. She was polite. She was not confrontational. She had lived in Harlem long enough to know that arguing with a police officer could lead to serious trouble. But she also had dignity. She was not going to be spoken to like a criminal when she had done nothing wrong. O'Brien walked up to her and demanded to know where she was going. She told him she was going home. He asked where she had gotten the money for the groceries she was carrying. She told him she had earned it from her work. He did not believe her, or he pretended not to believe her. He accused her of stealing. He told her that black women like her were all thieves, and that he was tired of dealing with people like her. Margaret Johnson told him he was wrong. She told him she had paid for everything in her bags and that she had the receipts to prove it. She reached into her purse to get the receipts, and that was when O'Brien hit her. He slapped her across the face with the back of his hand. Hard enough that she dropped her groceries and stumbled backward. Hard enough that people on the street stopped and turned to look. Hard enough that it was clear this was not an accident or a warning. It was an assault. It was a public humiliation designed to remind everyone watching that the police could do whatever they wanted without fear. Margaret Johnson did not fight back. She did not scream. She stood up, gathered her groceries and walked away. But she was shaking, and the people who saw it were shaken too. Because this was not just another example of police brutality. This was an attack on a respected woman who had done nothing to provoke it. This was an attack on someone's mother, and in Harlem, that meant something. Word spread quickly. By that evening, dozens of people knew what had happened. By the next morning, hundreds knew. People talked about it in barbershops and churches. They talked about it on street corners and in kitchens. They talked about it with anger and frustration because it was one more example of the powerlessness they felt every day. But they also talked about it with curiosity, because they knew that Officer O'Brien had made a serious mistake. He had hit Bumpy Johnson's mother, and Bumpy Johnson was not the kind of man who let something like that go unanswered. When Bumpy heard what had happened, he did not react immediately. He did not rush out into the street looking for O'Brien. He did not make threats or promises in public. He visited his mother. He made sure she was all right. He listened to her tell the story in her own words, and then he went quiet. This was not the behavior of a hothead or a street thug looking to prove something. This was the behavior of a man who understood that power is not about quick reactions. Power is about strategy. Power is about making sure that when you act, the consequences are clear and lasting. Bumpy Johnson knew that if he responded to this insult with simple violence, it would be dismissed as just another street crime, The police would crack down. His mother might be harassed further, and nothing would change. So he waited. He talked to people. He asked questions. He found out everything he could about Officer O'Brien, where he lived, where he drank, who his friends were, who protected him. He learned that O'Brien was not well liked even among other officers. He learned that O'Brien had debts. He learned that O'Brien had a gambling problem and that he owed money to people in the neighborhood. He learned that O'Brien was vulnerable in ways that most people did not see. Bumpy also talked to other men in Harlem who had influence. He talked to the numbers runners, the gambling operators, the men who controlled the informal economy. He reminded them that what had happened to his mother could happen to any of their mothers. He reminded them that if the police could publicly assault a respected woman without consequences, then no one in the neighborhood was safe. He made it clear that this was not just about his family. This was about whether Harlem residents were going to accept this kind of treatment, or whether they were going to draw a line. And then, about 2 weeks after the incident, Officer O'Brien disappeared from his usual patrol. He did not show up for work one day. The police department launched an investigation. They questioned people in the neighborhood. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. O'Brien turned up 3 days later in a hospital in the Bronx. He had been badly beaten. His nose was broken. Several ribs were cracked. He had bruises all over his body. He told the police he had been jumped by a group of men he could not identify. He said it happened in an alley late at night and that he never saw their faces. The police did not believe him. They knew exactly what had happened. They knew this was retaliation for what O'Brien had done to Margaret Johnson, but they could not prove it. No witnesses came forward, no evidence linked anyone to the attack, and O'Brien himself refused to name names because he knew that doing so would only make things worse for him. He knew that if he accused Bumpy Johnson or anyone connected to him, he would be marked as a target for the rest of his career. So he kept his mouth shut. Officer O'Brien requested a transfer out of Harlem. The transfer was granted. He was sent to patrol a white neighborhood in Queens where he would never have to deal with the people he had abused. And that was the end of his time in Harlem, but the story did not end there. The beating of Officer O'Brien sent a message through the neighborhood. It told police officers that there were consequences for certain kinds of behavior. It told them that they could not assault respected members of the community without facing retaliation. It did not stop police corruption entirely. It did not end the harassment and violence that Harlem residents faced every day. But it changed the calculus. Officers became more careful. They thought twice before publicly humiliating someone. They understood that the informal power structure in Harlem was not going to tolerate every act of cruelty. For Bumpy Johnson, the incident solidified his reputation. He had already been known and respected, but now he was seen as someone who could protect the neighborhood in ways that the law never would. He was seen as someone who kept his word and who understood that respect was not given freely. It had to be earned and defended. People came to him with problems. They asked for his help when they were being extorted or abused. They trusted him to act when no one else would. This moment also changed the relationship between criminals and ordinary residents in Harlem. In most neighborhoods, there is a clear separation between people who break the law and people who try to live honest lives. But in Harlem in the 1930s, that line was blurred. The people who ran the numbers games and the gambling operations were often the same people who loaned money to families in need, who paid for funerals when people could not afford them, who protected women from predators, and who stood up to corrupt police. They were not heroes. They broke the law. They caused harm in their own ways. But they were also part of the fabric of the community in ways that outsiders never understood. Bumpy Johnson became a symbol of this complicated reality. He was a criminal. He would spend much of his life in and out of prison for various offences. He would be involved in violence, in drug trafficking, in organised crime. He was not a good man in any simple sense, but he was also someone who believed in protecting his neighbourhood. He believed in loyalty. He believed in defending the people who could not defend themselves, and for many residents of Harlem, that made him more trustworthy than the police who were supposed to protect them, but who instead preyed on them. The story of what happened to Officer O'Brien became legend. People told it and retold it. The details changed over time. Some versions said O'Brien was beaten in front of his own home. Others said he was beaten in broad daylight on a Harlem street. Still others said he was not just beaten but permanently disabled. None of these versions were entirely accurate, but the core of the story remained the same. A police officer had crossed a line. He had assaulted a woman who was respected in the community, and he had paid a price for it. This legend mattered because it gave Harlem residents something they rarely had. It gave them a story about power that did not end with their own humiliation. It gave them a story about consequences that applied to the people who usually faced none. It gave them a story about a man who stood up for his mother and in doing so stood up for everyone who had been abused by officers like O'Brien. Whether the story was entirely true or not, it served a purpose. It reminded people that they were not powerless. It reminded them that respect was something that could be demanded, not just hoped for. The incident also had a lasting impact on how police operated in Harlem. The New York Police Department did not suddenly become a force for justice. Officers continued to shake down businesses, arrest people without cause, and use violence against residents. But they became more selective. They learned to avoid certain families. They learned to avoid public confrontations that might provoke retaliation. They learned that the informal power structure in Harlem was real, and that it had the ability to strike back in ways that the official justice system could not. This balance of power lasted for years. It was not stable. It was not fair. It was a product of a broken system that forced people to seek protection from criminals because the law refused to protect them, but it was real, and it shaped how Harlem functioned throughout the 1930s and into the decades that followed. Bumpy Johnson would go on to become one of the most powerful figures in Harlem's underworld. He would work with the Italian mob. He would serve time in Alcatraz. He would control gambling, loan sharking, and eventually drug distribution. He would become the man that people whispered about, the man whose name carried weight across the entire city. But it all started with the moment in 1935 when a police officer made a mistake, when he struck a woman he should not have touched, when he crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The lesson of that moment was not that violence solves problems. The lesson was about power and limits. In a society where the law protects some people and exploits others, those who are exploited will find their own forms of protection. They will create their own systems of justice, their own hierarchies, their own codes. Those systems will not be perfect. They will not be moral in any absolute sense, but they will be real, and they will shape the communities where official power has failed. Harlem in 1935 was a place where two kinds of power existed side by side. One was backed by the authority of the state, by badges and guns and courtrooms. The other was backed by loyalty, reputation, and the willingness to act when action was necessary. When those two forms of power collided, the result was not always predictable. But in the case of Officer O'Brien and Margaret Johnson, the result was clear. The man with the badge learned that his authority had limits, and the man who answered to the streets learned that his authority had just expanded. The story of Bumpy Johnson and his mother became part of Harlem's collective memory. It was passed down through generations. It was referenced in songs and movies and books. It was told to children as a lesson about standing up for family. It was told to adults as a reminder of what life was like in a time when survival required more than just following the rules. And it was told to outsiders as an explanation of why someone like Bumpy Johnson was not just a criminal, but a complicated figure who existed in a world where crime and community were impossible to separate. Years later, after Bumpy Johnson had died, and after Harlem had changed in ways that people in 1935 could not have imagined, the story was still being told. New generations heard about the police officer who hit Bumpy's mother and lived to regret it. They heard about how one act of violence led to another, and how that second act of violence changed the rules in a neighborhood that had been living under occupation. They heard about how respect is earned and how power is maintained. And they heard about how sometimes, in places where justice does not exist through official channels, people create their own justice, with all the moral complexity that entails. In Harlem, respect was not granted by law, it was enforced by memory. And after 1935, everyone remembered what happened when a line was crossed.